Welcome. This is Agile for Executives, seminar number 3. This is an event hosted by Agile New England. I'm Nancy Van Schoenderwert, and I'm an independent coach. I'm also the president of Agile New England, and I'm leading the Agile for Executives team. And last time we talked with Andrew and Julian, and they had run some experiments, and they were interested in a more decentralized approach to business. Their company, Matt Black Systems, had around 30 employees in their aerospace company, as we know. They had a traditional matrix structure, and we're all familiar with that. It's got its characteristic issues, right? The knowledge silos, the departments working at cross purposes, and so forth. And the question on their minds was, is this necessary? Do we have to, is specialization into functions an essential thing in business? Is it is it possible that a more decentralized model could even work? Well, Andrew and Julian decided that they were going to pursue that other path instead of continuing a struggle to make the matrix format work. And the key thing here is that there isn't any model, there's no business model that is totally problem free. Everything has its own characteristic issues. One of my favorite quotes from the book, it goes like this: it is not a question of how to eliminate problems, but which set of problems is best to live with in the long term. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. I'm going to turn things over to my co-host Vishal, who will say a few words and then we'll get started. Vishal?
Thank you, Nancy, and good afternoon to our guests today. Well, to introduce myself, I think that the best I would say in order to introduce myself is I'm a believer. I'm a believer in Andrew and Julian and their philosophy, and above all, what they have to offer through their learnings in years and years of experience. When we talk about diversity and inclusion and how important it is to an organization's success, it might sound cliche, but to break it down, diversity is the reality and all around us. Our action to embrace it and the steps we take to create value for all is the inclusion part. Or as one of my mentors and close friends would say, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. For me, this comes full circle with Andrew and Julian, who we have enjoyed listening to over the last few sessions. They both are quite unique in their perspectives and view of the world, and at times polar opposite. But how they've embraced each other's point of view and way of doing things to evolve their company and define the boundary conditions is a key ingredient to their growth. To date, we have been listening to their thoughts on how the industry is still evolving. What is the role of organizational culture in transformations and the motivations for MBT to drive the change, or as they call it, the Page 37 crisis moment. Hope you got a chance to see Andrew's video this morning on LinkedIn that, for me, personifies the fact that organizations are living organisms and not mechanical beings. Today, we will learn about their philosophy and experiments around decentralization and making their organization leaner in pursuit of creating flow and removing dependencies. With that, I will turn it over to our guests, Andrew and Julian. Welcome.
Well, welcome everybody, and I hope you enjoy today's session. I'm just going to give you a quick recap. We've, as Vishal says, been through our page 37 moment, where we had to relook at a business with a different lens. So previously, we'd been looking at our business as a machine and trying to patch the machine into action and improve its performance. But we'd failed to do that. So with our new glasses on, we started to look at our business not as a machine, but as an ecosystem. And of course, an ecosystem is something very different from a machine and demanded a different approach from both Julian and I. An approach, by the way, which we really didn't know about because we were really pioneering at this stage. What we did know is that in an ecosystem, the agents in the ecosystem make their own decisions. And that was a very important early insight. I'm going to pass over to Julian.
Yeah, I like that idea of us being pioneers. At the time, it felt much more like just stumbling around in the dark, just feeling our way forward, looking for anything we could do that might produce different results. So I should recap as well. So remember, we were a functional and hierarchical business. So we had subordinates and bosses in each function, things like quality and accounts and production. So we had supervisors and managers in production, stores, you name it, functional hierarchical organization. We've done lean. We've divided our organization to 4 lean cells just in the manufacturing area, and it cost us a lot of money. There was a lot of training involved, and in the end, it didn't produce better numbers on the bottom of our balance sheet and P&L account. And in time, all the changes we made sort of went away. In lean, they call it the grass grew back. So we entered this issue. We entered this this moment with the problem that 87% of the stuff we made was late. So our customers were screaming at us, and we were firefighting every day, sort of thing. And we kind of established that the problems weren't in the cells themselves, but all the interconnections those cells had to the supply chain, the purchasing and the stores and the production manager and everybody else who's, even inspection and quality, they all were involved in an internal kind of little production line we had going. So they weren't, our cells, our 4 lean cells weren't autonomous little units. They were heavily interconnected with the rest of the business. And it was that complexity which really, we could improve one part, but the other part would hold it back. And then we'd improve that, and then something else would hold it back. And it was really difficult to get any real change right down to the reducing our backlog problem.
It was very difficult to get real change. It's affected our metrics and measures, which we talked about last time.
Yeah.
So we could get real change within the processes, but we couldn't get real change overall to our overall company performance.
So we did our overtime experiment, and we discovered that this whole complicated thing, organism, this goo would react to a change in the rules. And we called the force involved our invisible manager, and our invisible manager seemed more powerful than our formal management team. So we changed the rules of the game, as it were. So there we were, still got the problem, and I was reflecting on why lean hadn't worked. The tools are pretty good, aren't they? I mean, you can't look at any of the tools and think, oh, that's rubbish, you shouldn't do it. And I started to read the old books, like Taiichi Ono, the grandfather of lean, his old books about how they, first of all, implemented lean in Toyota, but the principles on which it was based at the time. And what I realized was it was much more of a holistic thing. It wasn't a series of tools that were applied. The tools became clear after they were applied, but initially it was really about reducing those internal supply chains so they occurred all within just the work cell. And the phrase that stuck with me was co-located multifunctional teams. So they get all the bits of the assembly process and the manufacturing process into one place, and they'd have all representatives of those skill sets in that one place, and they were much more effective than if they had that sort of production line running through the whole factory. And so we thought to ourselves, well, having had the success with our invisible manager, how could we disconnect the cells from the rest of the organization? So we adopted this policy of moving as many activities as we could into the cell. So I'll give you an example. We had the cell guys ordering their own stuff. So we'd put them in contact with the subcontractor, and they'd place the order for something, repetitive work. So our old purchasing guys didn't have to do that. And that really helped the logistics of our organization. Things were ordered on time and arrived on time subsequently. And that was a good example of just the simple activity of buying was integrated into each one of those 4 work cells. We did something else as well. I should be just clear. We redesigned it on the way in. We worked out it cost £28 to get a component from somebody's mind in the cell, all the way through our purchasing procurement, through
centralized purchasing.
Centralized purchasing procurement, through goods inward, through inspection, through stores, and kitted and onto the workbench. And when we redesigned our process, it was down to £2.80. So we cut that by a factor of 10.
Yeah, but that meant every screw that we bought as an individual item cost £28 and a penny. So the cost of that cycle as it went through centralized purchasing, it was hugely burdensome on the cell itself.
So what other activity did we? So we redesigned the telephone system. We got a telephone system in which, instead of having a central phone line, which was then connected to the departments within, we had multiple lines coming into each cell. So now the cell could have direct communication with the customer. It wasn't through a production manager or a progressor or a chaser or something. And the result of that was the commitments made by the cell tend to be more honest, more direct, and more forthright. They're also more willing to live into them rather than just doing what the manager was asking them to do. So within the cell itself, as we devolved the activities, as many as we could into the cell people became in charge of how they did things and when.
Now that's what I meant to say. You see, we see what happened just there. He took over, he took control because it's on his linear thing to do. Yeah, it doesn't say Andrew on it. That's my bit, because I look at pictures. So I'm going to take over here because he's breached the rules. Essentially, what we've done now is we've devolved the activities, a number of activities which used to take place centrally. So obviously the customer, was now speaking to the cell directly and wasn't coming through the sales department. So the cells had started to integrate sales activity. We know about the stores because we've talked about them in a previous session, and we know also about purchasing because we've talked about that. So essentially what's happening is the scope of activities that the cell is doing is widening and widening and widening. And until, of course, until eventually it starts to resemble more like an autonomous unit. But at this stage, it's not an autonomous unit. So I'll pass over to Julian here, who will remember to pass over to me.
So we developed as many activities as we could easily do, and to help the logistics and the flow, as Michelle was saying earlier. But we still had an issue with resources. We had this issue that our goods were still coming through our central stores, and we talked about the story of developing our central stores. And again, we just took all the stuff out and put them into the cells so that the people in the cell were in charge of their resources. That's
so hold on, just one thing. What are resources? Because resources, you have to describe what resources
are. Okay, so resources are threefold. You've got equipment, obviously. Now that would be more applicable to a service industry, the PC and the or the Apple and the software you're running. Ingredients like the components used, that's what we think in manufacturing when we think of resources. Often we're talking about the components themselves that go into sub-assemblies and assemblies. And finally, the information, that would be the instructions and the drawings and et cetera, et cetera. Now, it doesn't matter whether they're online or whatever. The question is, are they held centrally and controlled by a gatekeeper, or are they available to the people who are actually doing the job? So we decentralized all our stores and had them flow, including our equipment library and everything, into each cell so that where they were used, they were stored. That gave the people in the cell immediate access to them and a visual indication of whether they had it or not.
So that was a big benefit, because in the original days when we had the centralized store, the people who were using the components couldn't see what was in store. So when the customer had a job on and they said, is it possible I could increase the quantity by, say, 2 or 3 units? The answer was always, oh, hold on, I'll get back to you. And then it was a whole complicated, again, go back to the centralized store, find out what's in the store, come back from the store, and then phone the customer up. Whereas when it was in right next to them, they could phone up, so the customer would phone up, and they could instantly give them the answer, yes or no, depending on what they saw in front of them. It seems so obvious, but yet it's not done very often.
Now, so the result of all this, the result of decentralizing our activities and decentralizing our resources, was that our backlog started to disappear. Now, combined with this, we also gave a backlog bonus. We finished off with our overtime, as we remember, and then we morphed into a backlog bonus. And the more of the sales backlog they worked off, the more sales we were making to our customers, more money we got, and now we could share the extra money with the people in the sales. So it wasn't a giant bonus, but it was a bit, and it was enough to say that if they could push out more work and catch up on their order backlog, they would do better as a cell, as a team. To summarize there, the cell were able to make better promises to their customers and they'd keep them. They'd also make better commitments to their subcontractors as well. So it actually went both upstream and downstream, as it were, upstream to the suppliers, and downstream to the customers. So the final result of that was our backlog almost disappeared. We went down probably to 10% of things which were late. It wasn't perfect. We were aiming for perfect, but boy, the telephone stopped ringing with irate customers. So that was a fantastic improvement.
Yeah, okay, can I just interject here, because we moved ahead one step too far. I just want to try and focus on what we have achieved when we devolved the resources to the cells. So the cells now had stewardship of our resources. So what we're saying here is they didn't own the resources, because that was owned by the company, but what they were responsible for them and stewarded them. And it was as good as it was their resources. And I think that's an important move, because now we've got both activities, sales, design, etc., devolved, and now we've got resources, nouns, components, methods, all these things that are tangible, we've got them devolved into the cell. So the cells are looking really quite different. And they're behaving quite differently as well. The telephone system's been changed, so the customer's now ringing them up. They're now taking some real responsibility, which wasn't seen beforehand. They're beginning to act like a microcosm. So when I started, I said, we're thinking of it as a microcosm, talking about individuals within a microcosm, and now it's beginning to appear in front of our very eyes, the behaviors that we wanted.
So let me interject then. So when Andrew says the behaviors change, what people were doing were they were changing what they were doing. They're becoming more effective. So they were buying differently. Let's start there. They were buying differently. So their components, the ingredients they were using, were better than we'd been buying before. Not just cheaper, often, sometimes more expensive, but they just made the job easier. So they were working smart, not hard. Not only were they buying better in terms of materials, but they were also rearranging their workflow and weren't stopping and starting jobs as shortages occurred. Things were much more smooth. Vishal's flow was improved enormously. And innovation was going on in jigs and fixtures on the workbenches, as well as the movement of stock. There's all sorts
So
of
the
things.
stuff we couldn't get them to do before by shouting at the frogs
Yeah,
was now starting to be done.
yeah.
Yeah, but we weren't shouting at frogs anymore.
So, on reflection, as Andrew says, what really changed was the people in the cells weren't looking to the rest of the business inside the four walls of the factory. They weren't. Their focus wasn't on them. The focus was now on suppliers and on customers. They were focused on externally, not within the four walls of the organization. And that's before it was like we were all in a circle looking inwards and trying to manage the merry dance that was going on internally. And now suddenly the dance was very simple within the cell and all the focus was external.
Yeah. Are you begging for questions here?
Yeah, do you want to any questions so far?
I think so. There's a hand up there. Hi there.
Hello, thank you. I had a question. Were these cells producing the exact same things, or were they producing different products? And
Good question.
were there learnings across cells that were kind of organically being absorbed across cells, or was there a way in which there was a formal way to kind of share, if you will? So if a cell were to burn down their backlog and the profits were being passed, to them in cell A, but not in cell B, like, did that get shared and did that lead to optimization within the cells?
So the first answer to your questions was they made the same thing. They were customer-facing cells, so they had a relatively tight product range. Although our customers desired quite a portfolio of products, so that kind of changed and morphed all the time. To look at to answer your other question, to speak to that, we didn't have a formal mechanism for exchanging, let's call it best practice. But if somebody was going home with more money,
The others soon learned.
Funny enough, that communication went quite easily. And often they would ask why. And there was often some resentment sometimes that they had an easier job than we did, sort of thing. It's all right for them, sort of thing. But I suppose when Andrew talks about that microcosm, that organism, they were reacting to their own set of problems and finding solutions to those because they knew the big picture was we could get bonus if we could do something like the other cells doing. So does that answer your question?
I'd like to add something, if I may, Iran, because I think one of the interesting points here was not so much in the product diversity, but in terms of the approach diversity. So the customers started to demand more individualization. So one customer, for instance, would be dealt with by one cell, would say, is there any chance you could change, how you handle our purchase orders, or how you acknowledge our purchase orders, for instance? And there would be subtle tweaks made to the organizational model of each cell until they started to become quite distinct in how they were operating. They weren't operating all as like a central control system. They started to operate really, one customer, for instance, would say, I want this done this way. Another customer would say, I want this done another way. So the cells began to adapt to their individual environments, their wider context, if you like.
So an example of that would be, you'd have one customer who had a buyer on the phone all the time, reordering things, rearranging things so that it was meeting the demands of his internal organization. Very, very human to human focus. Another one wanted us to have access to their MRP portal so we'd react to their system. So one of our members of our team would have a password onto their system, would react to the demand on their system. So different customers wanted different things, and our different cells could align themselves with what the customer wanted.
But funnily enough, our central organizational model was really struggling.
So the people in the old central functions, like quality and inspection and accounts and all those people, they hadn't changed at all.
But also the model, because the model was the central organization. We released goods to AS 9100, ISO 9001. And of course, as the cells start to stretch to do things in different ways, when the auditors come in, they say, well, this cell's not doing it the same way as this cell. You've got a centralized system. How are you going to handle that? And it's a real challenge because the customers were demanding different things for us. And we're going to cover that in later on. It's still an important point to the next point we're going to make. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
It might over answer it.
No, it did. Yes.
Sorry for that.
No worries. Thank you.
So we had this new approach. We devolved our activities and resources, and it threw up a whole bunch of new problems. We're back to what was said earlier about you have to choose the set of problems that you want. Well, when we devolved our activities and resources, we ended up with new problems. So our cell teams would blame quite a lot of the external teams, the other people in the organization. They'd blame them for their shortfalls, their problems. And they would start to say, it's their fault, not ours. What can we do? So we started to look, how could we integrate? I think it's speaking to the comment you made earlier. How can we formally integrate the other functions in the organization? And we went round and round in circles looking for, how could we do that? And in the end, we decided to copy a free market. So we set up a free market within so that the people could trade between cells like resources. So ingredients, we had lots of specialized ingredients, also some general ones, loo paper and cups and coffee and things like that. But also screws and washers and stuff. And what we wanted to be able to do is internally be able to move those from cell to cell so they could trade. So we didn't have to carry excess stock in each one. There's also a problem that our cells are quite small. So during sickness and holidays, there was a shortfall of people. And they wanted to be able to move people around as they went. So again, the internal market allowed them to subcontract help from cell to cell.
But it wasn't really distinguished as an internal market at that time. It was just like a trading agreement between people.
But we wanted a formal way of doing it.
Exactly.
We wanted to be able to track it because we were calculating the value add of the organization and each cell. So we knew the value add of the organization as a whole. And then the question was, what's each cell contributing to that? And I should mention here, we had costs in the old organization, like the quality department, that we were trying to work out, well, how do we attribute that to each cell? So this was the primary reason why I put an internal market in, because we figured what happens out there in the real world, that's why we call it fractal, what happens out in the real world works well enough and is cheap enough to operate that we should do it inside as well.
Can I add something in there, Julian, about a point which I think is, some organizations have colleagues' letters of understanding. In other words, kind of an agreement between parties that they will do work. But of course, that was no good in our organization, and that had to be formalized. So with every agreement, came the money to get the work done, because only in that way could we retain our measures. If you remember our metrics and our measures, our high-level measures were internal and they were essentially financial, whereas our external measures were QDP and C, which are contract related. And we wanted to keep them internally for the sales as well. And that was driving the emergence of this internal market as well. So over to you.
So yeah, it wasn't just the trade of the things.
No.
It was trade of the things in return for money, and that was critical because it meant that people who were adding most value were getting the most money. So let's have a think. So
we had to transfer money internally.
Yeah. So we had an account system that we had to invent to deal with that, where we had like wooden dollars which we were exchanging. Right. So this internal trade and our desire to share costs appropriately between the cells meant, like the quality department had to identify as a cell how much they were going to charge the cells for the work, the quality work they were doing. Boy, that caused a lot of problems. They were very frustrated that for a little while that went on, and then they said, "Look, we've got costs, and these costs should be borne by the cells." So they basically take all their costs, they divide it up, and then add that onto their bills, add that onto their internal invoice in the internal market. And of course, as far as the cells were concerned, they were being overcharged. So the cells started to say, "Well, we're not happy with this." Now, back in the day, in our old organization, the sweet spot was to be indispensable. Some of you might recognize that. You might have colleagues who they're the only one who can do a certain job, and therefore it's a way of increasing job security is to be indispensable in an organization. I've met people who will always do the shitty job in an organization because they know they're the last to go. And we shifted our model so that the people who added most value had the most job security. Now, the people who organized themselves into a tight little box, which is indispensable, and were then overcharging the cells for their work, found themselves feeling very vulnerable.
And so I'll give you a real example of that. I'm going to use the accounts department. The accounts department was charging each cell for raising and processing an invoice, and it was £17 for a sales and a purchase invoice. And the cells were very frustrated by this, and they said, "Well, this is ridiculous. Why are we being charged? If we're processing 100 invoices, £1,700." And of course, the accounts department said, "Well, we need the money. We need the money to pay the salaries of the accounts department." So eventually what happened, the guys said, "Well, we're going to do it ourselves." So we couldn't stop them. They were independent, they were autonomous. And so they started to raise the invoices themselves.
But at that point then, we had to integrate some new systems, like we devolved the purchasing. Yeah. We then had to work out, well, how are we going to do invoices and stuff like that? It's really the heart of our administrative system, that was centralized. We had to unwind that and separate them, yet have all the invoice numbers be sequential and all those hassles. But we did that because the cells were just demanding not to have to pay all this money out to the bookkeeper and the accountant. And the result of that was
the accountants put their prices up.
Yeah, because they got less work, obviously, because like 2 of the cells would carry on using them and 2 of the cells would do their own. Because some of them would say, "Look, I just make stuff. I don't want to do any of this paperwork."
The accountants are fixed cost.
So then what happened is the accountants then said, "Well, it's £34 an invoice." Well, obviously, isn't it? Because we're doing half the work.
Well, I still need paid.
We've still got the same cost. So it used to be 17. So now we're doing half the work. It must be 34 each. And of course, then the 2 cells that were still getting the accountant to do the work for them, the bookkeeper, suddenly said, "Well, it's not sustainable at £34. We've got to change. We've got to copy what the other cells are doing. We don't want to do the paperwork, but it's getting unsustainable to get the accounts department to do it." Funnily enough, the accounts department weren't willing to shrink themselves or find other things to do. It's most curious. You'd think accountants would be the ones who are most switched on to like the supply and demand tensions but anyway.
But there's an important point here, because the accounts department was acting as a box. That box was shrinking, yeah. And the result of that was they eventually got to a point where they couldn't pay their own salaries. And they went bust. The accounts department went bust. And we removed the accounts department. And because it was now integrated into the individual cells, there's no point having an accounts department because there's nothing for them to do.
So
we've got a question here. What have I done wrong, Vishal?
No, I just wanted to pause. There are a few questions here. I think we have Mark, we have Carolyn, we have Marcel. Just want to give them a pause to ask those questions.
Fire away, guys.
Mark?
Mark, hi.
Hi. So it was very interesting, this story about the accounts department, and but I was just curious, how did you all support the systemic needs? So you need to make IT changes in order to allow the cells to do to do invoicing and still capture your tax information and all that kind of
Brilliant.
stuff. How did you manage to orchestrate that consistently or inconsistently with what was going on in the rest of the organization?
Well, yeah, okay, so I can answer that one. So previously, yeah, we the idea was to implement a kind of centralized IT system, and we'd half done that, if I'm honest. And so we in my language, we had replaced the steam engine with an electric motor. And so we just simply maintained the central functions. Of course, as the internal market started to arise, we realized we had to design a completely new system in order to handle these cells and the cell autonomy. So we quickly rushed up a relatively simple IT system that would process orders and process invoices.
So let me translate that into real things. We did a shitty job and we used spreadsheets.
We did.
Each cell had a spreadsheet to start with. And it was relatively simple. The information they had to capture at that time was relatively simple. And in some ways, it was an experiment. If it works with spreadsheets, hell, we can improve it.
But we did also, for instance, capture the contracts. Yeah, we captured the
Delivery.
The actual delivery, the booking in and booking out of goods, and we captured the invoice. So these are the only three things we really captured. Capture the contract, capture the goods being dispatched to satisfy the contract, capture the payment. Job done. So good enough.
So I want to give you that sense, Mark, that we took our effort away from measuring processes and we put an effort into measuring these high-level QDP and C numbers. So we tried so much not to ladle on any costs, no admin costs. Whatever we put in, we tried to rip something out. Does that make sense? Great.
And so you would watch for these obstacles to these opportunities and quickly kind of swoop in and put your focus on removing those impediments in some simple way and then evolve it later. I presume eventually the IT department became a profit center of its own and started providing services and so forth, but you sort of helped.
Well, the centralized IT department went.
But you're right, Mark. That's exactly what happened. Essentially, they were able to subcontract that. So where were we? So we end up with these top level measures, QDP and C, and the sales were focused on adding value rather than maximizing the efficiency of the process. It allowed the population within the cell to flex and change and be more dynamic in their responses to the customers, and also like shortfalls in supplies. Also, so that if there was a problem with the supplier, they'd find new ones and stuff. It was much more flexible and responsive.
A bit more punchy.
It was, a
little bit more
that was
punchy.
very interesting. Yeah, that's true. Language started to change. So the language internally was very, I call it amity, the kind of easy getting on with people. But when we changed to this new system, people got a lot more punchy with their language, a lot more like, come on guys, stop messing around. Whereas before it was, they talked about football and they got on well. And in the same token, some old animosities appeared because people had the choice of who they work with. Two people would be falling out and you'd overhear them saying, well, you did that in the Christmas party in 1987. And you think, whoa, blimey, there was a lot of history going on in our place that was bubbling below underneath the camaraderie, the surface.
The amity.
Yeah, the amity. So So given this QDPC measures and the value add, we now called our manufacturing cells, we call them contract cells, because they really had contract measures on them now, rather than internal process measures. All the process problems, we tried to leave within the cell and have them innovate their way through those.
So they were dealing with purchase contracts and sales contracts now. So and they were much more focused now on making sure their contracts were satisfied. They were buying components from suppliers and services from suppliers, and they were selling goods to customers via contracts. That's why they were called contract sales.
So I want to get the sense of why it worked. You know, what can you extract from this? Partly it was autonomy. So the cells now had autonomy over the equipment, their information, and their resources. How they did the job and when they did it. They felt like they were in charge of their working world. In addition to that, the teams themselves were now self-selecting. I get to work with people I want to work with rather than the people I've been put with. And so we've got some movement between teams, some people left, and the cell teams got really super hyper functional as a result. And we saw this through innovation and the dynamic self-alignment. So nobody was telling him to do anything, but the organization was much, much more efficient.
So I'd like to just come in here, and I'd like to start to go back to where I started from, and that was the ecosystem. At this period of time, we really saw the organization more as an organism now. The organization, you could see that the cells were actually becoming autonomous. You could see that they were trading together or working together, and it became a more, it's tempting to say homogeneous unit, but it was the complete opposite. It was a more diverse unit, yeah, that was trading together in a much more fluid way. In many ways, less control. There was very little control Julian and I had from the center. And to be honest, that was a bit anxiety provoking for us, because we felt we couldn't intervene and we could see some mistakes being made. And that was, you know, in one case, one guy ordered 13 years of glue syringes, 13 years worth of glue syringes, and a juggernaut turned up with boxes and boxes and boxes, all because he saved 2 pence per syringe.
By buying bulk.
That was our fault because we didn't put a balance sheet on them. You know, they were just dealing with value add. He says, I can get this 2 pence cheaper. He buys bulk quantity, and we have to store 13 years of glue syringes. But hey ho, that's part of the learning, isn't it? It's part of the growth.
Fumbling around in the dark.
Fumbling around. But we got the real feeling that we're dealing with something very different here now. We're not dealing with a top-down organization. We're dealing with something which has got a certain amount of life and of its own, and an autonomy of its own.
Ability to solve its own problems.
And definitely an ability to solve its own problems.
Nancy.
Yeah, Nancy.
Can I just butt in for a second with a time check? We have 3 more minutes. I see a comment here in chat about what about economy of scale? Do you want to say something about that? And then let's use the remaining time to take questions, okay?
So
Does that suit everybody?
I'm going to say that the anxiety of the economies of scale really burned in me, that I couldn't understand how it could be any better to divide our purchasing up into little bits. So I thought it'd be much, much worse, but we ran the experiment.
I didn't. I knew it wasn't.
Yeah, well, we might. Yeah, hindsight's 2020, isn't it? So what we did is we tried it in a small. We called it crash worthy. We do an experiment we thought might not even work, and if it went wrong, the idea was it wasn't to cause catastrophic failure. It had to be crash worthy, and we could revert back to the way we previously did it. And when we tried devolving our purchasing, splitting up by cell, we found that when people bought their own parts, they were better at negotiating. Great. When they bought bulk, they'd arranged between themselves that they'd buy it in bulk and then divide it up once the supplies arrived. So we got really good prices on our bulk purchasing as well. So we had both. We had the economies of scale and the focus of individual purchasing on individual custom
So
products.
the flexibility. So we had economies of scale and the flexibility.
So,
So we got better.
we would just be willing to try experiments because it seemed counterintuitive, but we gave it a go. And what we always found was it was much better than we could ever imagine, and not always for reasons we understood well. Back to that fumbling around the dark. So, any more questions?
Let's see if there's any hands up. I don't see hands up.
Oh,
Vishal,
It was,
you have some more?
no, I was only going to say that Vishal's question was mine. I was thinking about
sorry.
the larger ecosystem, about the suppliers and the economies of scale, when you went from centralized to units. And I had missed that, whoever answered that a couple of weeks ago. So thanks for all of that.
That's all
How
right.
these suppliers adapted to the change from central purchasing and probably a cadence of delivery and that kind of thing to dealing with the cells. But it sounds like the cells work that through in an innovative way.
And also the suppliers, because they, instead of dealing with one person, they were dealing maybe with 4 or 5. And that was a challenge for the supplier as well. In fact, they adapted very well because the people who were purchasing it knew what they wanted much better than the centralized purchasing team did. So
big companies were fine
Okay.
with it.
That's the balance I was looking for. Is
Yeah.
that the units knew better what they wanted,
yeah,
to be much more specific. So there's this
Yeah.
trade-off there.
yeah.
And we had far fewer errors. That was
Oh,
good.
okay.
Because people knew
So
what they
that's
were buying.
That's very thorough, very helpful.
Great. So last thing, have we got any time to do any more, Nancy? or-
We're just about at time. If there's one more quick question, we could do that.
Yeah, let's do that.
If not, I'll share slides again.
So perhaps we should just finish by saying, as we progress from here, we just kept dividing our cells and making them smaller and smaller and smaller. Again, a little bit counterintuitive, and every time we did that, we got a benefit.
Yeah.
And the problems we had in the base of our organization were with people who were still trying to become indispensable in that internal supply chain. And as we divided up, those people became more and more obvious, and people didn't want to trade with them anymore.
So one point I'll add on that one is that one of the mistakes we made in this was rather than, so when we started and looking at some of our sales, some of the performance was poor. What we did was we put in training. Again, that was a mistake. We spent loads and loads of money. In fact, that was part of the £250,000, the $300,000 that we spent was on this mistake. So rather than when we finished up, splitting the cell in two, identifying the poor performance and identifying the good performers, we spent the money on training. So when we identified the poor performance, we could do something about that and leave the good performers to fly. I think that covers that, doesn't it?
Yeah, we take a cell which is poor performing, split it up, we find we have 2 halves, one good performing and one terrible. And the terrible one tends to be somebody who tried to make themselves indispensable, even within the cell.
So the message from this is split and integrate.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
Keep splitting and integrating.
But don't divide to conquer, divide to combine, if that makes sense.
That's a great insight. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Everything I have now is anticlimax. Just to wrap up a little bit, I want to say that next week we're going to see how the rise of accountability culture happened. Basically, these centralized administrative tasks began to really show up even more strongly as obstacles to the cells being able to contribute value. And so some more things had to be done to deal with that. So those topics come from chapters 7, 8, and 9 in the book. It'd probably be helpful to read those beforehand. You can see on this slide the names of the upcoming seminars. I want to just remind people that if you have colleagues or other friends you know that would be interested in this series of seminars, it's not too late for them to sign up and get all the benefits, because anyone who signs up can still receive the book. They will get the videos for all the past sessions and, participate going forward in the remaining ones. So we'd like you to urge your colleagues to join. That would be great. As you can see on the slide here, we're going to talk about a rise of accountability culture next time. Right after that, control changed from traffic lights to roundabouts, making use of multiple controlling minds. And lastly, we'll talk about fractal work patterns being released into the wild. And I just want to remind people that the place to sign up is the agilenew-england.org site that's shown here on the slide. And also, you can go to that same spot, agilenew-england.org, and underneath the Follow Us header at the right-hand edge of the page, you'd be able to sign up for our public Slack. And that's where we have a discussion group dedicated to these seminars. So if you're reflecting on something you heard today and you'd like to, you have some more questions that you wish you asked, well, you can still ask them. Andrew and Julian are on that channel, and all of us who produce these seminars are there too. So we'd love to see you there, and we'd love to see you next time.